amongst equals, at least in their own minds. And this is called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, primarily between the French and the British. And they're going to divvy up the land when the dust settles at the end of the war, regardless of who's living here. And in 1917, the Balfour Declaration. And the Balfour Declaration, which was Lord Balfour, the foreign minister of His Majesty's government, which says, writes a letter to the most important Jew that they associated with, Rothschild Jew from the British side of the family, and they write, His Majesty's government sees with favor the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, which on the one hand sounds wonderful and truthfully doesn't mean very much because it's not giving us any clear indication. Now, there are reasons to believe that at that point the British were in fact favor of Jews being returned to their land, because we know that there is a messianic movement in the 19th century within that leadership of the British that gets transferred over to the current leadership. Let's see if I can do this now. Great. So we're just going to go like this for a moment. And we're going to go like this and share screen. Nope, we're going to do this slideshow presenter view. Quickly going back to the beginning. Okay, now, so again, real quick, you can take a look at the maps, the Sykes-Picot Agreement that we mentioned already, the Balfour Declaration, which you have in front of you, again, promising something to the Jews with, on the one hand, a messianic movement who wants to see the Jews reconstituted in their ancient homeland as part of a messianic dream, in the sense that once Jews are returned to their land, it's another step towards the return of their Messiah, of Jesus Christ in their minds. In addition, there were Jews who in fact were very useful for the British during World War I and friendly with, and one of which was Chaim Weizmann, later to become the first president of the State of Israel, who, among other things, in addition to being a politician later in life, of course, and a Zionist, and as I mentioned, the first president, was also a scientist. And he invented synthetic acetone, which helped the British win World War I with the creation of explosives. So all of this comes together in this Balfour Declaration. Each one of us, meaning the Jews, the French and the British, and the Arabs, all thinking that, well, we have the upper hand, and ultimately, and as we can see, the questions that rise from the underlying parts of this declaration won't be enough to dissuade the Jewish leadership at the time, which ultimately say, that's Chaim Weizmann and David Ben-Gurion, we don't like it, but we'll take it. Now, in the immediate aftermath of World War I, there's about almost 2 years in which is a military government here within the area of Palestine, as it was called since the days of Hadrian, Emperor Hadrian. We've spoken about that already, the origins of the name of Palestine. And the British Army would be in charge until they handed it over to Herbert Samuel, who will be the first High Commissioner here in the region, designated by the British to be in charge of the mandate being mandated by the League of Nations as part of the aftermath of World War I. We know of the Conference of Versailles, and we know of the regiving of land and borders, and there's a movement, not to mention reparations that Germany has to pay. All of that is happening, including in our region. And as we move forward, we constantly are seeing Jews on the world stage. Amongst them, of course, Albert Einstein here, who, by the way, at a certain point was offered by David Ben-Gurion to become the first president of the State of Israel, and he declined. We can make some arguments as to how smart he actually was by understanding that that was not for him, but he is going to identify that even before there is a state, we need institutions, we need culture, we need science, we need universities. And you can see the excerpt that I've chosen, but again, to give us a sense that that concept of nationalism, and if you remember at the end of last session, I spoke about the nationalism fervor that was being felt. We, Jews, of course, are going to be influenced in the 19th century by what's happening in Europe, although we have 3,000 years of fervor of being part of a nation. But we know also that the Arabs are going to be influenced by this nationalism, which unfortunately will come at our expense. And we're going to see a cycle of events that unfold in the 1920s and the 1930s, all the way through post-World War II and post the Holocaust. Now, what you're looking here, first of all, is in the blue. You can focus on the highlighted blue that I have here. It's a lot to read, and it's probably too much for a slide, but that's okay, because as I'm speaking, you can go through and you can see that it seems as if, on the one hand, the British are saying, yes, that we are going to follow through with our promise of the Balfour Declaration, that somewhere in Palestine there'll be a Jewish home. And yet, we also know that there's going to be a challenge within the governance of the mandate if too many Jews arrive. Now, where do we see this? Well, we see this, and we begin to, and I am happy to send all of these slides if anyone is interested, not to mention further reading, but we can take care of all of that because there may be times that we go too quickly for people to read. The idea was just to get some primary sources in, to get a sense of what was going on and what was the style of British leadership, because in their minds, they had an even-handed policy. However, in 1922, we begin to see the how this policy is going to play out. Now, this mandate for Palestine, which is ultimately going to be voted on from within the League of Nations. Remember, we had the Balfour Declaration. That was an internal document by the British government at the end of World War I. But now we're having the world recognize that as if not a legal binding document, absolutely something which will influence the ultimate goal of the British, which is to follow through with that. And we can see that in this excerpt here from 1922. But as this is happening, we're going to see a cycle of events. In the aftermath of World War I, we have immigration. And the immigration will be a continuance of the type of immigration that happened between 1904 and 1914. If you remember, we spoke of the second aliyah, the second wave of immigration, which brought us the kibbutz, and it brought us David Ben-Gurion, and brought us Rachel the poet. That's the period of time. The same type of labor Zionists will continue, 17, 18, 19-year-olds in the aftermath of World War I, to be known as the third aliyah, the third wave of immigration. And we have that immigration. In response to that, we have riots of the local the local Arabs who are here, led by a man by the name of Hajj Amin el-Husseini. Now, I have a picture here of the Western Wall as it looked in that mandate period, because some of those riots that took place happened because of the congregation of Jews at the Western Wall to the claim of Hajj Amin el-Husseini that the Jews were trying to steal away the holy sites of the Muslims, and as they call the Western Wall, they call it El-Burak's Wall. It's where Muhammad ultimately tied his winged beast when he traveled from Mecca to Medina to El-Aqsa. But what happens is we have immigration, we have riots against the Jews, and as part of their even-handed policy, the British will institute something that they call the White Papers. Now, I'll just go back for a second. Oh, sorry. One second here. Just get all your faces out of the way. Now, these white papers that we see will, in a sense, provide for the Arabs the ability to at least step off of the branch or move themselves back a little bit. Why? Because what the British do in these white papers, on the one hand, they're saying, yes, we still want to follow through with the Balfour Declaration. However, we are going to restrict immigration, and we will not allow more Jews than we think are able to fill the growing Jewish settlement beyond its economic capability of absorption. So ultimately, if I sum up what the white papers are, they are restrictions on Jewish immigration. They are restrictions on Jewish land purchase. Now, these white papers will be instituted in the early 1920s, in the late 1920s, in the mid-1930s and the late 1930s. Even on the eve of World War II, 1939, white papers will be in effect. And even after 1945, when the Holocaust comes to an end, white papers are still in effect. Now, as part of that, what you see on the screen right now is really the first attempt since the days of Shimon Bar Kokhba, with the Bar Kokhba rebellion of 132 to the Common Era, for Jews to organize themselves and create an army of sorts. Now, truthfully, there was self-defense, even in Europe at the beginning of the 20th century, and even in the Jewish settlement in the land of Israel, in an organization called Hashomer in 1905, which means the guard. But as far as some kind of frame of an army, the Haganah, born in 1920-21, which will be the precursor to the IDF. Now, the Haganah, as the official security wing, military wing, defensive wing of the leadership of the Jewish settlement and the Jews in Palestine, they will have a crack commando unit in the 1930s to be known as the Palmach. The Palmach is an acronym, Plugot HaMachatz, and they are, again, part of that Haganah. Yitzhak Rabin will, when the War of Independence begins, be the deputy commander of the Palmach. In 1930, a group from within the Haganah is going to go ahead and say, wait a second, what good is it if we stay on our fences and wait to be attacked in order to defend ourselves? In fact, that's what Haganah means. It means to defend. We can't do that anymore. We have to be more offensive. And around 1930, we see a new organization rise up, an underground organization called Irgun Tzva'i Leumi, the National Military Organization, sometimes just known as the Irgun. And the commander of that Irgun would ultimately become Menachem Begin, later to become Prime Minister of Israel. We'll talk plenty about him as we move forward. You can see a few other names on the screen right now. Also in 1930, there will be an organization that is out of the Haganah, whose job it is to go ahead and help Jews smuggle themselves into Palestine, the Mandate of Palestine. This group will be called the Mossad Le'aliyah Bet, the Organization of Clandestine Immigration, or as the British would call it, illegal immigration. Now, later, of course, Mossad Le'aliyah Bet becomes the Mossad and ultimately our version of your CIA. In 1939, just jumping ahead with the last name on the screen, the Haganah, at the head of which stood David Ben-Gurion as the head of the Jewish settlement in Palestine, known as, the word settlement in Hebrew, Yeshuv, he says, we're going to go ahead and fight with the British in Europe. And we're going to continue to smuggle Jews in, and we're going to do it all at the same time, because we have to do what we need to do in order to save Jews in Europe. The Irgun says we can get behind that. And they fall back into the fold of the Haganah and join forces. And the group that breaks away from them and says, are you insane? What good is it going to be if we join forces with the British? They're not here for us. They're not fighting in Europe for us. And proof of that, of course, is the white papers, not to mention the restrictions they're putting on us. And therefore, we have to do whatever we can to get the British out of Palestine. Fresh in the minds of these who are going to break away from the Etzel is the Evian Conference that took place a year earlier in July of 1938 in France, in which the world gets together to save the Jewish refugees of Europe. And each delegation gets up to say how important it is to save the Jews of Europe. And one by one, they make it very clear why they themselves can't save any Jews, can't take any Jews, including countries like Australia and Canada and the United States, which says, you know what, we've already filled our quota of German immigrants, so I'm sorry, we can't really take any more in. So this is fresh in their minds, and the Lechi, Lochamei Cherut Yisrael, the freedom fighters of Israel, is born. Again, one of those underground units who the British will call terrorists, who will do whatever it takes to get the British leadership out. And the military and political leadership out, one of the commanders would be Yitzhak Shamir, later also to become a prime minister in the 80s. Now, these organizations will be the backbone of the Jewish defense that's taking place in the 1920s and 1930s. Now, what you see on the screen, I think, is really important for us to take a moment and slow down, because to understand what did it mean to be an immigrant, what did it mean to have these overlapping layers of arrival? Because we had that first wave that came in the 1880s, the second wave that came in the beginning of the 20th century, the third wave. So by the 1920s and 30s, you're starting to see a mixture of people literally just off the boat and those who have been around for 20 or 30 years. It wasn't easy. The immigrant experience, even when they were all Zionists, even when they all wanted to come together, just as I mentioned, in the early days before the kibbutz was invented at the beginning of the 20th century, it wasn't that everyone was just singing and dancing around the bonfire at the end of every long day of work. There was real tension. Now, Laya Goldberg, one of Israel's most premier poets, who was a woman who comes from Eastern Europe and ultimately, when she's 25 years old, will immigrate to Palestine. She's keeping a journal in Hebrew already when she's 10 years old. And she was brilliant. She knew multiple languages. In addition to writing poetry, she was a novelist, and she taught literature, and she was a professor of comparative literature. And she was one of Israel's most premier translators of text, translating War and Peace and other famous pieces. And she is going to, a little bit later in her life, after this experience, she will revert back to those 1920s and 30s when she arrives in 35, and she'll talk about the challenge of what it meant to be someone, the new kid on the block, when everybody wants you to conform to be like them. Now, the poem you see on the screen, Ilanot, it's called in Hebrew, or pine, as you're reading along, you can perhaps begin to notice that she is talking about two different places, two different homelands. She's looking at the pine tree in her new homeland, which is her ancient homeland, and she's reminiscing of the land of her birth and the pines that were there, and the different kinds of birds in the snowscape mountains that were in one and not the other. And I think she does very well. She's able to express something that in the 30s and the 40s, and even in the 50s and the 60s, it would be a while until those new immigrants were able to internalize, not to mention the other Israelis who surrounded them, that in fact you can be built up with the roots of two homelands. And I think that's very important to understand. Who are these people that are coming? It is not a utopia. It is not something where everyone sees eye to eye, and yet we all had that same goal. And the 1920s and the 30s, that goal was to create a Jewish state. Now, what we're looking at here is we're looking at one of the first attempts of the British to divide up the land. And what ultimately was going to be, what was initially offered as certain cantons of Jews living in one area and Arabs living in another area, and the British being in charge of everything, with pressure that was being presented on the one hand by the Jewish leadership in the diplomatic relations that they had, and perhaps because they understood the British so well, they knew in fact how to engage them in conversation. People like Chaim Weizmann, who was a loyal British subject. However, on the other end, we begin to see in 1936 what will be called the Arab Revolt. It will be called the Arab Revolt by them, by the Arab leadership. And for 3 years, there will be a revolt in Palestine as they feel that the land is being taken away from them. But once again, we have waves of immigration, we have riots against the Jews, and as a response, we have the white papers. Now, in addition, what the British are going to do in the 1920s is they're going to put their weight behind that same Hajj Amin al-Husseini to become the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, which is the supreme Muslim ruler, thinking that the religious responsibility will calm things down. And instead, what it does is it fuses the nationalistic fervor and the religious zeal, and in fact makes things worse, that will ultimately erupt in this Arab revolt. But this partition, which will ultimately, if not painfully, be accepted by the Jewish leadership, is going to be rejected by the Arab leadership. And I say Arab leadership because we don't know what the people wanted. We just know what their leaders responded. Now, as I mentioned before, on the eve of World War II, you can see the quote that I was referring to with David and with Paula Ben-Gurion, his wife. We must assist the British as in the war as though there were no white paper, and we must resist the white paper as if there was no war. And when World War II is going to begin, of course, the rise of Hitler, which happens earlier, and as I mentioned, I believe I mentioned at some point earlier on, that we would not be focusing on the Holocaust. That is a separate conversation. But there's going to again be a split within that Jewish leadership and within this different defense. How do we get the job done? And it will not be inconsequential, because that will come back later on and we will see even more division amongst ourselves. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, 1945, all of those three units come together: the Haganah, the Etzel, the Irgun, and the Lehi, in a national, the National Hebrew Rebellious Organization. And the idea was to get the British out, because the white papers are still in effect. However, in 1946, we begin to see really the deterioration of that unified effort when the Irgun, headed by Menachem Begin, would go ahead and threaten the British: if you don't end these white papers and allow us, those that survived the Holocaust, to come into Palestine, we will blow up your headquarters. And their headquarters at the time was at the King David Hotel, that iconic hotel on King David Street that was built at the end of the 1920s. Not hearing this threat, Menachem Begin follows through, and the Irgun follows through, and in milk cans will smuggle explosives into the kitchen of the King David Hotel. And in July, the southern wing of the King David will be blown up, and 91 Jews, Arabs, and British will die in this attack. This will put the British on a rampage, as you can imagine, even more than they did in the past against the Jewish leadership. This will divide the Jewish leadership. On the one hand, David Ben-Gurion, a particular stance on how to get the British out, and the Irgun, a particular stance of how to get the British out. And amongst all of this chaos, we're going to now see more Jews trying to smuggle themselves in. And within this clandestine immigration, about 122,000 Jews will attempt from the early 30s all the way through 1947 to get into the land of Israel, most of whom will be captured by the British, either placed on ships and sent back to Europe, or sent back to other internment camps, for example, in Cyprus, and some taken off and put in internment camps on the land of Israel in Palestine, in a place called Atlit. Now, the picture that you see, of course, the Exodus ship, Haganah ship, Exodus 1947, of course, that famous movie and book that was written, which is an amalgam of different stories of clandestine immigration. There really wasn't an Ari Ben Knaan. That was one good-looking Jew, if you saw the movie with Paul Newman. But the story of the Exodus is that those 4,500 immigrants on a ship that was meant for about 1,000 is going to be rammed by the British, drawn into port, and the Jews will be taken off and sent back to Europe. But this chaos, which is being created in Palestine, will be enough for the United Nations, which has just in 1946 been created to replace the League of Nations, and they will go ahead and create a fact-finding team to be sent to Palestine to figure out what to do. And this fact-finding team will be called UNSCOP, United Nations Special Committee on Palestine. And they will spend several months here in Palestine. And ultimately, on November 29th, 1947, they will, having brought their recommendation to the United Nations, will see the United Nations at Lake Success vote on whether or not they should accept what would be called the UN Partition Plan of 1947. Now, on the map that you can see, the area in white was to be designated for the Jews. The darker, whatever color that is, grayish, greenish, whatever that color is, would be an Arab state and an international area around Jerusalem and Bethlehem. Now, while the Jews themselves would have received, percentage-wise, slightly more than the Arabs, about 60% of the area designated to the Jews, as you can see, those who know the map, know that that's the Negev, thank you very much. And again, indefensible borders. And again, perhaps tactically, or rather strategically in the long game, the Jewish leadership say, we're going to accept that. Why is that so important to understand? Because in the aftermath of this vote, the Arab leadership, both internally in Palestine and externally outside the land of Israel, outside of Palestine, because we know we have not yet heard the name Israel for the name of the state. That's going to come a little bit later. That's rejected on the Arab leadership side, and the War of Independence will begin. The first phase of the War of Independence will go from November 29th, 1947, actually the following day, November 30th, and will last until May 14th, 1948. That will be a civil war. Now, I am not here to go ahead and to line up the amount of massacres conducted by the Arab side against the Jews, or to speak of the retaliation of the Jews against the Arabs. You can do your own research for that, and we can't create a certain value scala to decide, or a moral scala, who is right and who is wrong. All I can tell you is, again, and this is all stuff that you can check on your own, that there was an acceptance on one side and there was a rejection on the other. And again, that doesn't and shouldn't define for you who the speaker votes for today, because historical context is significant, is important in understanding what it is that we believe, so we have a foundation on which to share our understanding of what is going on today and what needs to happen. Now, of course, you can see here, and I spoke a little longer than I wanted on the previous slide, but there was celebration in the air. And the dancing in the street, and some of you might have seen some film, and some of you who had even been at the Independence Hall in Israel, there's a film there, and they've actually, it's not exactly fake news, but they've gone ahead and they've spliced some of the scenes so that it seems as if people are dancing in the street after the Declaration of Independence. In fact, the dancing in the street happened after the vote in the UN. And then that internal war, that civil war amongst Jews and Arabs are going to take place. Of course, of the leadership at the time, we would be remiss if we weren't going to speak of one of those pillars. Of course, Golda Meyerson, to become Golda Meir, and her trajectory from Ukraine through Milwaukee, and as a young woman, as part of that second wave of immigration, come the third wave of immigration, would find herself following her dream, and that is to be in Palestine. She, among many other things, was responsible in many ways for the establishment of the State of Israel. She will be one of the two women signatories on the Declaration of Independence. And of course, later in her life, will be the Prime Minister of the State of Israel. But this, the leadership of the time is that wave of labor Zionists that came, and they would ultimately fulfill their dream as we make our way closer to May 14th, 1948. However, we have to slow down for a moment. And I wanted to share with you this particular poem written by Natan Alterman. And I'll give ourselves a minute to start to read through it slowly. Even if we don't get through the entirety of the poem, you should know that sometimes it is mistakenly thought that Alterman writes this in the aftermath of the War of Independence. And in fact, he writes it as a column in a newspaper in December of 1947, immediately after the beginning of the first wave of this War of Independence. Perhaps as foresight, perhaps as falling back on the history of the Jewish people and the pain and suffering they had gone through up until then. But this notion that we are not going to get a state handed to us on a silver platter is going to be this notion that's taken from a speech that was given by Chaim Weizmann right after the United Nations vote. But I think this is it's chilling in its foresight as to what in fact would necessitate the establishment of the state of Israel. And that silver platter, and he talks about the young man and the young woman, the young boy and the young girl. Then they fall back into darkness as the dazed nation looks, and the rest can be found in the history books. On May 14th, 1948, David Ben-Gurion is going to go ahead and, along with his provisional council, is going to make a decision to declare Israel a state. Why May 14th? Because midnight, May 14th, so between the 14th and the 15th, which is between Friday and Saturday in that month of May in 1948, the British are officially leaving the country. Now, when they leave, well, that's midnight and it's on Shabbat. Ben-Gurion has to make a decision. Do we declare as soon as they leave? But wait a second, even though most of us are secular Israeli Jews or secular Jews in the land of Israel, we still can't declare the Jewish state after 2,000 years of yearning on a Shabbat. We're not going to wait until Saturday night because there is no such thing as a vacuum in this region. If we don't take hold of the institutions of governments that we've already created over the last 30 years, well, it'll be harder to fight off the onslaught that we know is going to happen. And therefore, he moves up the events. And the iconic words that will be shared in the Declaration of Independence. And truthfully, one of the two miracles that took place there was that the invitations that went out the day before, in which 300 invited guests were told to come dressed for the occasion of a very fancy event. We can't tell you what it is exactly. I mean, we can't tell you the name of it, but it's going to be the Declaration of the Jewish State. And it's going to take place in the Art Museum of Tel Aviv because we can't do it in Jerusalem because Jerusalem's under siege, both by the Arab villages and by Jordan on the other side. And we can't do it in Habima Theater, which is a large venue with beautiful stage and glass windows, because it's too much of a target. So the Art Museum was taken. And in this photo, if you look, you can see to the right of the curtains, the high windows. You actually go down a few steps. It almost feels like a bunker. And Ben-Gurion will read in 32 minutes, starting at 4 p.m., because the event started on time, which is really, I think, the first of the two miracles that took place, a Jewish event that started on time. And during this reading of the Declaration of Independence, he will speak of the historic connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. He will talk about the thousands of years of continuing to yearn to connect to this land in a visceral way, even if we weren't physically here. He will speak about the vision of the prophets of the kind of society we want to create here. He will talk about the Holocaust and the decimation of the Jewish people of Europe. He will speak of the United Nations legal pronouncement that there should be a Jewish state. He will talk about, in the second part of the declaration, reaching out to our neighbors in peace. Talking about the fact that this country should be a place for the ingathering of the exiles, of the Jews, a home for all Jews. The locals who are not Jewish will be equal citizens. And then he ends by saying, with trust in the rock of Israel, we declare the Jewish state a reality to be known as the State of Israel. He takes his gavel, bang, 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 and as though lofting from the heavens, Hatikva, the national anthem, will be heard as a national anthem of the State of Israel for the first time, because it had already been a national anthem of the Jewish people since the 19th century, when Naftali Hertz Imber wrote those words. Lofting down from the heavens, because there was no room in the art museum, they put the symphony on the second floor. And as they hear these words of Hatikva, David Ben-Gurion will ultimately walk out of the room knowing that the second phase of the war is about to begin. And that second phase of the war, what you see on the map in front of you, are a bunch of red arrows going inward. And what this is, essentially, is all of the Arab countries around simultaneously attacking the young state. Now, to make a very long story short, this will be our longest and most painful war. And at the end of which, we win. And how do we know we won the war? Because we weren't annihilated. There was no middle ground. And you can see the picture to the right of the map is the last battle that takes place in the War of Independence, March of 1949, when we arrive in the city of what will become the city of Eilat. You can see the Eilat mountains in the background over there. And when that war ends, you can take a look at the map right now, and you can see all the area in blue, in light blue, that becomes the State of Israel. And as you probably can notice, and we can go back for a moment if you want to take a look, you can see the partition plan. And in fact, we ended up with more land than we would have had the Arab leadership accepted that partition plan. This particular outline of the map will be solidified in September of 1949, when Jordanian officers and Israeli officers, now Israeli officers of the IDF, will sit around, the Israel Defense Force, will sit around a table on the island of Rhodes. Somebody will say, hey, where are your troops? Where are our troops? Somebody hand me that green wax marker over there. Let's outline that. And that ultimately will become what we call the Green Line. Now, that's all well and good. Again, we won the war. We weren't annihilated. We have more land than we would have had we had the Arab leadership accepted the partition plan. And yet, we also lose 1% of the Jewish population. 6,000 Israelis will lose their life in the War of Independence out of 600,000 Jews who were living in the State of Israel at that time. However, we are also going to be introduced to, sorry, just one second, to some new terms. And the new terms that we're going to be introduced to are the Palestinian refugees. Now, it's important to understand again that I use the term Palestinian refugees, although at the time you were more likely to hear the term Arab refugees of Palestine. And while it might be nuance, it might be semantics, the notion of a nation forming and in the popular press to be known as Palestinians will really only develop in the 1950s and 60s. However, that's not to say that the seedlings of that weren't already happening. Now, anyone who describes that there's only one reason for Palestinian refugees, in my mind, regardless if they are on the left politically or on the right politically, either, and I'm just going to stop the share for a moment, either doesn't have all of the information or they are purposely trying to mislead us. Because I would say, in most cases, although not all cases, it should be clear, things aren't always black and white. There are cases where there are, and that's a different conversation. However, in this particular case, three main reasons. One, people don't want to be around war. Families don't want their children to be around war. And if we just look at the human disaster that's been happening in Syria since 2011, we know There in Syria, before their war, 22 million Syrians, and today 50%, 11 million are refugees. 5 million externally and 6 million internally. So reason number one, why they're Palestinian refugees, because of the war. Two, because Arab countries around Israel will tell the local Arabs living in Palestine, get off the land, let us come in, we'll destroy the Zionists, and then you can come back, no compromise needed. And the third reason was because during the War of Independence, the Israeli forces at certain points in the war turned to local Arabs who were living in places like Ramle and Lod and Jaffa and Haifa and said, hey, local Arabs, we don't have the time or the wherewithal at the moment to discern who is friend and who is foe. Jordan is that way, go. So there were cases, in fact, where the IDF sent those Arab citizens towards Jordan. Again, that statement should not define for anyone what Uri thinks personally, politically. Because I can make an argument why that statement is strong on the left for a statement and why it's strong on the right for a statement. So, three main reasons. Now, that, by the way, will be the reason that those Palestinians who are living within Israel today as Israeli citizens and those Palestinians who are living outside of Israel today will identify the same event that Israeli Jews will call the War of Independence as El Nakba, or in Arabic, which is in English, the catastrophe. Again, you can imagine the challenge, mele, as we say. Let's say those outside of Israel will call it the catastrophe. But there is added challenge, of course, when citizens of the same state, some will see that event as the catastrophe and some will see it as independence war. And how do you create a vibrant democracy that allows for both those voices? Maybe it's not possible, I don't know, but again, a conversation down the road. Now, a few other things before we take our 10-minute break, before we come back for the last session. What's happening in the aftermath of the war itself? Now, what we're looking at right now, actually, I seem to have lost everybody, but can you see me? Hopefully people can see me. Wait, I'm just going to do this. Hold on a second. Now, what we see here, Operation Magic Carpet. I just want to make sure that, right? Oh boy, what did I do here? Sorry. Just 1 second. Okay. I'm just going to get out because I don't even know if anybody sees me anymore.
Uri, I can see you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Thank you. I don't know what happened to my...
I can see you, but we didn't see a screen share.
Okay, great. So let's do this. We're going to come back there. I'm not sure why that happened. But, okay, so let me just do this then. I'm going to do this. That's why it happened. I got 2 ahead of myself. There we go. All right, I think. Are we seeing the screen right now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, there we go. Now we're back in the screen share. And we're going to do this. Okay, 1950s. These are going to be incredibly important years in understanding the psyche of the Israeli, because a few things are happening. First of all, in the immediate aftermath of the War of Independence, we not only are going to see ourselves rising up after being able to hold off the entire Arab world and the pain of loss of 1% of our population, but as true to Ben-Gurion's vision that Israel should be a place of the ingathering of the exiles, we begin to see mass exodus of Jews from Arab countries. Now, it's not that all of a sudden all these Jews just wanted to leave. They're being exiled. They're being kicked out. In fact, there is, along with the 700,000 Palestinian refugees, there is another 800,000 refugees that are out there. And those are Jewish refugees being kicked out of Arab countries that we call Mizrahi Jews, Eastern or Oriental Jews. from Yemen, from Morocco, from Iraq. In one of those operations, we can see here Operation Magic Carpet from Yemen, 1949, 45,000 Jews will come to the land of Israel, the state of Israel, on 380 different flights. When this is happening, Israel is transforming itself. Its population will double by 1952. And Open Arms, altruistically, will go ahead and say, hey, brothers and sisters, come, this is your home. But we don't know exactly what we're going to do with you. And what ultimately ends up happening is we place those new immigrants, by the way, also refugees from the Holocaust, from Europe, are going to be arriving at the same time. In fact, in the 1950s, there was nothing more synonymous with the word refugee than the word Jew. And yet, within a decade, there were no longer refugees who were Jewish because of Israel. And of course, other countries then opened their borders as well. Now, the Ma'abara, or in the plural, Ma'abarot, would be these shanty towns. They would be tent cities outside of the big cities in which Jews would be kept, supposedly temporarily. And yet there were even times where there were several years that went on where these Mizrahi Jews were kept. Now, on the one hand, you have the notion of the Israeli who is there altruistically to come and help his brother and sister, her brother and sister from Arab countries. And yet what you begin to see is the perpetuation of a two-tiered society in which the Mizrahi Jew would be pushed down by the Ashkenazi leadership. And let's just be clear, and I mentioned this earlier on a few sessions ago, that early wave of immigration in the 1880s and 1890s, while many of them, in fact, most of them were coming from Eastern Europe, there were already Jews also coming from Yemen and other Arab countries. But the primary leadership at the time, the Ashkenazi Jew, is going to create this two-tiered society, one that will erupt in the late 60s, early 70s in a movement to be known as the Black Panthers, emulating the Black Panthers of the United States, seeing themselves as a second Israel. And in fact, that movement would be the movement in the 1970s that will propel the Likud party, at the head of which stood Menachem Begin, to be on top and to become prime minister. And I just want to show you this clip here. There was a great movie made in the 1960s called Salah Shabati. And Salah Shabati was a movie depicting life in the late 40s, early 50s. We'll only see a small snippet. It was an incredible success. It's a comedy, but a very hard-hitting look already in the 1960s at a critique at Israeli society. Salah has just come with his family, and they have arrived, and hopefully this will work as I intended to. Come on, come on, come on, come on. We're going to give it 10 more seconds. If it doesn't click, we're going to move on. Of course, in all my practice runs, it was working. Okay, we can come back to that later if we want to. Oh, there it is, of course. Oh, come on.
רק בשביל כמה ימים אנחנו מקבלים שיכון יפה. למה אתה צוחק? למה? יאסקי גולשטה. אין דבר. סלח שבתי. בבקשה להיכנס. זה מקום יפה, זה הרבה אוויר. מתי בחדום גולדשטיין במחבר? לפני 6 שנים.
Okay, so again, this notion of on the one hand, altruistically taking care of their brothers and sisters, on the other hand, clearly creating this two-tiered society. In fact, there is discrimination in Israel that has nothing to do with Jews against Arabs, as some people might perceive, but it's Jew against Jew. Now, there were, in fact, a few other events that took place in the 50s that will be important to touch on before we find our way in 1967 and the Six-Day War. But we're going to take a short break, stretch our legs, and we will come back, if that's all right, in 7 or 8 minutes so that we can still have a full session to round us off to 2020. Does that sound okay?
That's perfect, Ori. Thank you.
Okay, great. So we'll see you back here in about 7 or 8 minutes.
How about a question?
Yes, please.
Is there still a cultural difference in Israel for the Mizrahi?
Very good question. It depends who you ask and when you ask it. What do I mean? I mean, we've gotten to a point now where, truthfully, I would say that there is a real, there's a mixture of, I mean, yes, you can identify where your grandparents came from, and right now it's all grandparents. It's still a society of immigrants, and you still have people coming from various parts of the world, but conceptually, those Mizrahi Jews who came in the 50s and the 60s, and maybe even the 70s, it's their grandchildren now who are living. For example, my brother-in-law is Israeli, Jewish, but he's Iraqi because his family hails from Iraq and was part of this immigration in the 1950s. Now, interesting enough, those Jews who arrived from Iraq, as opposed to those Jews from Morocco or Yemen, were actually very, very wealthy Jews and had to leave everything behind. And yet they fall within that category of Mizrahi Jew, and there will be that challenge. And yet today, my sister, who is an Ashkenazi girl, it's a mixed marriage of sorts, right? So you have this intercultural marriage. However, we're all Israeli. That's a kind of a long-winded answer to yes and no. Yes, we still can see some cultural differences. It doesn't always line up to what we assume. Sometimes people say, oh, it must be political, or it must be music. No, you have people on both ends of that spectrum who enjoy different foods, different culture, different political parties, different music. However, I mentioned before, it depends when you ask. And speaking of politics, there are still those who would fan the flames of the ethnic differences between those Mizrahi Jews who still contain within them the visceral memory of being Second Israel, as they call themselves. And some might even say using it for political gain. Now, does that mean that in fact there is no discrepancy and there is no problem? We're not in the Messianic age yet. We haven't reached the promised land, as it were. Meaning you can still see discrimination. Now, the discrimination in Israel isn't lined up solely between those who are Ashkenazi and those who are Mizrahi. You have those who live on the periphery in towns down south or up north in the Galilee, as opposed to the center. If you live in Carmiel, or if you live down south in Yokneam, in Mitzpe Ramon, meaning on the outskirts. So you have that as well. And in Israel, and we can talk a little bit about the economy. We're really not going to get too far into it. Unfortunately, Israel is where America is vis-a-vis its economy, and there's about a 14 times gap between the top 10% and the bottom 10% on our socioeconomic scale. So you have discrimination there again that doesn't necessarily define itself along lines of Mizrahi Jew or Ashkenazi Jew. Today in Israel, of the Jewish population, which is about 6.5 million, 60% are Mizrahi Jew, about maybe 55 and 45% are Ashkenazi Jew.
Wow.
I can tell you that if we're talking about an upheaval of Mizrahi culture within the greater Israeli culture, that can in fact be felt within the music scene of the young people. And that if in the 1980s, it was Zohar Argov who was really the first to break through with Mizrahi music on the radio stations. First, before he was allowed to sing on the radio, he would make cassettes of his music and give it out at the central bus station in Tel Aviv. Today, I would say 8 out of 10 of the most prominent Israeli singers are of the Mizrahi musical genre. So that we're seeing a kind of a renaissance of sorts that is the apex of which I don't know if we've reached yet, but it doesn't matter who you are and what your background is as a kid, everybody likes that kind of music.
I have a question.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have a question. Not too long ago, some new archives were opened, and I was wondering if there's any news about the missing Yemeni infants.
Yeah. So I don't know if everyone is aware, but for many, many years, there were rumors, assumptions, beliefs, depending on who you speak to, that Yemenite immigrants who came were told that their children, some of their children died either in childbirth or were sick and then died and disappeared. And there was a belief for many, many years that in fact, those children were taken and given to Ashkenazi families, either who lost their children in the Holocaust or whatnot. While yes, there were archives, and yes, there were discrepancies, and some might even point to proof, that hasn't yet been publicized to the point where people can say, yes, my child, in fact, legally has been recognized as having been kidnapped by the institutions of power in the 1950s and 60s. So it is still somewhat in a gray zone, even though for some, no further proof is needed. Did it happen broadly, widely? Probably not. Did it happen at all? There's enough evidence to indicate that that could have been happening in the 1950s, in fact.
Yeah, okay.
Again, as part of the,
Yeah.
we move forward in this kind of post, I don't even know what kind of post-world it is,
Right.
but one of the, when I travel to Masada, I talk about, in Israel, those of you who've been, I'm sure you've been to Masada, and those of you who've been to Israel with me, of course, we were there together. But the notion of Masada, so many of you might know, this notion of us going up to praise who the Zealots were as the last stand against the Romans, which is why for so many years, Israeli soldiers would march up and be sworn in on top of Masada.
Okay. Do you have any plans to talk about the nation-state law at some point in your discussions?
Hold on, I was just in the middle of a.
Oh, I'm sorry, I apologize.
That's okay. So while that was once the mantra, and in fact, Masada shall not fall again was a mantra on which those early Zionists were able to raise themselves out, not literally, figuratively, out of the pogroms of Europe. Meaning we can finally latch on to a part of our memory in which we didn't hide in the corners, but in fact stood up to our enemies, even to the very end. And it would be that mantra of Masada shall not fall again that no doubt was on the lips of those in 1948 who stood against all of those Arab countries, and was in the minds of those in 67 who charged up those hills, and was in the hearts of those in 73 who stood in the breach. And maybe it was necessary. But the truth is, one, we don't know exactly what happened on Masada, because while there's some proof based on the physical evidence, what Josephus Flavius tells us, we don't know exactly what his angle was, or we can imagine. And two, truthfully, we know the Zealots weren't always so nice to other Jews who didn't think like them. So would we go up to Masada to glorify Zealots when in fact I myself, I would hope I wouldn't be a Zealot in that sense that I would kill another Jew if they didn't think like me? What I'm trying to say is that I think that if we can accept that a nation as it evolves in its early days perhaps needs certain myths and mantras to help it stand up to face the challenges that it will face. Think about how perhaps you were taught about Thanksgiving and how your children or grandchildren are taught about Thanksgiving. And today, I think we're more ready to look at the reality of who the Zealots were with a critical eye, not to disregard who they were, And perhaps we go up to Masada still, not necessarily to glorify who they were, but maybe we go up and we say, I'm not gonna lose this mountain because of my newfangled idea of being able to be critical of myself and my heritage, but I'm going to reharness it as I better understand history, I better understand myself, and I'm more secure in myself. And therefore, maybe I don't honor who they were. I honor and I go up to Masada because perhaps to honor why they did what they did. Because in their mind, hopefully they were doing what they thought they needed to do for Jewish continuity. And that I can latch onto. What I'm saying in this modern era, I think we look at certain elements like the children who disappeared, who were taken, who were kidnapped, however we want to see it, the Yemenite Jews. And on the one hand, we could say, how can we be so disparaging to ourselves to air this dirty laundry into the world? And yet I think it is a sign of greatness, of maturation, that we can look critically at ourselves and even look at those things that perhaps were of the times, as terrible as they were, and to identify that we need to be able to name that in order to be able to move on. All right, I don't know if we're gonna get to the nation state law. We'll talk about some of the other challenges in our politics, but I am gonna jump right in right now and continue where I left off, if that's okay. And hopefully those who will join in will jump right back in. In the 1950s, in addition to what we were seeing, we see almost a civil war. And the civil war that we almost see, oh, you know what, let me reshare my screen. Already made this nice little presentation, I might as well use it. Okay, and this civil war is absolutely nothing between Jews and Arabs, but Jews and Jews. And it's based on what is going to be presented to the parliament in 1952, when Ben-Gurion realizes that if we don't have any funds, we will not be able to survive. We have no exports to speak of. We're doubling our population. We have no infrastructure of any kind to speak of. And we are about to receive reparations from Germany. Now, you can see the numbers on the screen. David Ben-Gurion knows without this money, we don't survive. Menachem Begin will make it very clear, and he is the head of that demonstration you see on the photo. If we go ahead with this acceptance of money from Germany, we will burn this country down. Mr. Ben-Gurion, he said, he never called him prime minister. Mr. Ben-Gurion, how much is my dead family worth to you? We'll never accept this blood money. Ultimately, we accept the money, and there isn't a civil war. But this is part of the challenge that we're facing 4 years into our country, and we almost lose it all. On top of all of that, we are dealing with ongoing terror. There are some people who will claim that there is terrorism today, Palestinian terrorism, because of the occupation, using that language. Now, whether that is or that isn't, again, it's not my place at the moment to discuss, but I will tell you that up until 1967, we had over 1,000 Israelis who were killed in terrorist attacks. So that means is there's ongoing support by the Arab countries around us for this ongoing terror. Now, one last thing of the 1950s, come 1960s and 1967 that I want to mention, and that is that with all the greatness of the Declaration of Independence, up until the year 1966, while there were already in the very first parliament of the State of Israel, Israeli Arabs who were members of that Knesset, the Israeli Arabs, who today more likely than not we would define as, or they would define themselves as Palestinian Israelis, there was martial law for those Israeli Arabs. They had to, they couldn't leave their homes at night, and they had to get a special permit to leave their villages. And yet, in 1966, somebody wakes up in the government and says, if we're going to live up to our own ideals, we cannot continue with this discrepancy between Israeli citizens. Does that mean that everything's perfect today? No, it doesn't mean that everything's perfect today. In fact, I would probably not be too hard pressed to look at any other democracy and to realize that, you know what, I think they have some issues as well. Not that that is an argument we should all look at ourselves internally. I'm just saying that there was a repeal of that martial law in 1966, and this is while we're still under threat, and there's still the challenge of terror and the threat of war. And that will lead us to 1967. And for that, I'm going to shift to a different slideshow here. So bear with me for just a moment. And we'll go like this. And sorry, I didn't want this one. I want this one. Okay. And we're going to go to slideshow. Okay, 1 second. One moment. Okay, why isn't it doing what I want it to do? It could be because I have too many things up. Hold on 1 second, sorry. Oh, sorry about this, folks. I've never used 2 slides at once. We're just gonna go like this. I'm gonna go like this. Come on, come on, come on, come on, come on. Okay, I'm gonna start talking and hopefully you can still hear me and we'll be okay. Let's go like this. Sorry. All right, I don't know what is going on here. Sorry about that. In 1960, can anybody hear me? I don't even know. I can't tell.
Yes.
Yeah.
You're fine. Yep.
I'm sorry about this.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
All right. I don't know why I can't come back to the screen. Let's try this. All right. We're going to do this. Okay. We're back in business. Sorry about that. Okay. Here we go. Let's just do this. Oh, God. Oh, right. Hopefully you can see the screen.
There's a debug in the system. It took me 20 minutes to log on.
So maybe it's not me. All right, so let's do this. Okay, if I can't come back to it, if I can't see you, then so be it. But for now, you can see the screen. And now we're looking at our last session.
See the screen.
You cannot see the screen, of course not.
No.
Okay, all right, thank you for sharing that. Come on, come on, come on. All right, so you know what I'm gonna do, actually? I think I'm gonna, Rabbi Boxman is okay. I don't know if it's the system or it's me. I'm gonna get out of the system for a moment. I'll be right back, is that okay?
Absolutely.
All right, I'm gonna log off here if I can, and I'll be right back. Sorry about that. Talk amongst yourselves. Can't even get
Did you ask for get his plasma?
Balfour just said, huh?
Yeah, right. You know, yeah, when you walk by before, you could.
Nasen.
You know, I took
And I did
air.
Arlene.
And same for me. I realized that they saw me walking away and walking back.
David is Debbie Warren.
Doesn't mean everybody.
Donna's
Eleanor Bonder. Too early, Katie. Too early. Gotta wait. Oh, yeah. You gotta wait. You gotta wait, Cookie. Raven in here somewhere. Leah Bob.
The immediate family,
Don.
kids, our kids, getting together.
With that asshole, then he melts her.
And they're-
They're both giggling, and then he stood up on a water slide and was
Her neighbor.
I didn't go in the pool for a year.
Being very
we don't hug each other or anything like that. We kind of, try to keep our distances and so forth.
We're just waiting on Ori. He had a problem with his technology, so he should be back in just a moment.
Ariel, it's Mickey Seibel from Har Sinai Congregation. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Good, thank you.
I hear you're the mother of 2 boys.
I am, yeah.
That's fabulous. Are you happy in Naples?
Yes, very, thanks.
Great. And you're close to your family.
Mm-hmm.
You can fill me in now. How are the other girls?
They're good. Tali is a nurse here in South Florida.
Wow.
Yep, pediatric
Great.
nurse. Yep, and Ashira just got accepted to rabbinical school.
Well, another Boxman. Oh my gosh, that's fabulous. Where is she going to go?
Also HEC.
In Cincinnati.
I don't know. I think she's hoping, she hasn't found out yet. She's hoping for New York.
Oh, of course. She's still hoping for New York?
Still hoping. She'll find out this week.
Yeah. That's great. It was great talking to you. You look terrific.
Thank you.
Do you remember me?
Absolutely.
Everybody knows what you're saying.
Okay, go ahead, talk to other people. Okay.
I am back.
Okay, good.
Great.
Yay, welcome back.
Sorry about that. We're going to get right back into business, and we're going to share. Oh, okay, in a moment. Rabbi Boxman, if you can let me share again, that'd be great. What's going on? So we know between the 50s and the 60s, Israel is becoming its own. In addition to all those challenges, we just want to live our lives. And we're doing our best. And yet, of the challenges we're facing, are even how do we deal with the Holocaust survivors? How do we go about and incorporate them into our society? We go ahead and actually tell them, hey, brothers and sisters from the Holocaust, this is your home. Do me a favor, though. Don't tell me your story. Don't tell me your personal story. I don't want to hear it. Now, that's harsh. And yet, in the reality of those Israelis, look at what we were able to do in 48 and in 50 and throughout the 50s and how we defended ourselves. You know what? You're here because you didn't fight with Mordechai Levitch in the ghettos. And you didn't fight in any of the uprisings, because if you fought in the uprisings, you wouldn't be here right now. So yes, you're welcome, but be more like us. And do me a favor, lower your sleeves. I don't want to see that number. Now, again, these are very harsh statements, and yet that is the reality of the time. And for the survivor who's being told, don't tell me your story, they internalize that along with survivor guilt. They never tell their story. And in most cases, second generation children of survivors will not hear why mom wakes up every night screaming or why we have no uncles and aunts or grandparents. That begins to change in 1960 with the trial of Adolf Eichmann. Because for the first time after Israel goes ahead and captures him in Argentina and puts him on trial, for the first time we in Israel hear the personal story. Because we do communal memory better than anyone else. Tell us why we celebrate Passover 3,500 years ago. I can tell you. We tell every year our children. And yet the personal story, I don't want to hear it. Until the 60s, when in 1916 the trial comes on and Gideon Hausner, the chief prosecutor, is going to get up there and is going to interrogate Eichmann, who will begin to share his role. And then more important than that, witness after witness will get up and they will share their story. And for the first time, we begin to hear why mom cries every night. Then 1967 is going to come along. And when 67 comes along, there is such a fear in the country, and hopefully this is going to work this time, and we're going to share the screen. There's such a fear in the country that there's going to be a second Holocaust in the months leading up to the 6-day war. Sorry, we can get through this first slide. All right, we know that I'm going a little nuts with my slideshow here. Okay. In the months leading up to the 6-day war, which starts in June 5th, 1967, the period of time will be known as the waiting period. And there's such a fear that thousands of graves are going to be prepared in the national parks in Tel Aviv, in the stadiums of Tel Aviv, because we feel like there's going to be another onslaught. We've watched geopolitically what's happening in the region where Gamal Abdel Nasser is moving his troops into the Sinai Peninsula, which up until then were supposed to be a demilitarized zone since 1956. UN, by the way, tells Nasser, if you continue to move your troops into the Sinai, we're out of here. And the Egyptians say, fine by us. And they begin to move their troops into the Sinai. In addition, the Egyptians are going to close the Straits of Tiran, which is the bottom of the map, closing the Gulf of Eilat to international shipping, closing off an international artery for the state of Israel, also an act of war. And they nationalized the Suez Canal. Not to mention the 19 years of ongoing support of terror, as did Jordan, as did Syria, against Israel. Not to mention that Gamal Abdel Nasser will say very clearly, Zionists, yeah, we're going to destroy you, and we're only telling you because we're so benevolent and you can evacuate whoever you want. There was a joke going around at the time, the last one to leave at the airport should shut the lights. This was the only way we were going to survive. As this is happening, Israel starts the Six-Day War on June 5th, 1967. Now, you know enough to know already that we don't start the war, but in fact, we conduct a preemptive strike. Because all those acts of war that I mentioned before was in fact starting the war. It should have been called the One-Day War, because within a few hours, on June 5th, 1967, all of the Sinai is in Israeli hands as we take out most of the Egyptian Air Force while it's still on the ground. It should have then been called the 3.5-Day War, because within 3.5 days, all of the area of the West Bank, and I would tell you that the West Bank is the more generic of the terms, as opposed to the occupied territories, either with quotations or without, and someone saying occupied territories most likely identified with the left. And another way to call that same geographic area would be the area of Judea and Samaria, the biblical names of those areas. So that would be more of somebody identified with the right wing politically, and the West Bank of the Jordan River is the term that we'll use, even though that too can be politicized. But within 3.5 days, the West Bank is taken and Jordan's pushed out. And then the settlements in the Golan, at the foot of the Golan Heights in the Hula Valley will tell the Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, and will tell Yitzhak Rabin, the Chief of Staff, the head of the military, and will tell Moshe Dayan, the Minister of Defense, if you don't do something about these Syrians, we're out of here. Because the Golan Heights, which sits right over the Hula Valley, we're done raising our children in the bomb shelters. And therefore, the decision is to push the Syrians out as well. And miracle of miracles, we're able to survive. Not only are we able to survive, but we in fact are so victorious. And you can see these two images here, which are so iconic, connected to the Six-Day War, that we triple our landmass. It's David and Goliath all over again. In fact, we are as strong as we were sure we were. And then in 1967, Moshe Dayan is going to make it very clear, the Arab world, if you want peace, you need to call us. Once again, it's a very drastic and perhaps militaristic statement, and yet within the context of that reality, perhaps we can understand why after the last 19 years. And the Arabs, from their perspective, the Arab leadership in Khartoum in North Africa will get together and they will make the statement of the three infamous no's: no negotiation, no recognition, and no peace with Israel. Between 1967 and 1973 in the Yom Kippur War, we will ultimately see ourselves on the one hand try and become the nation that we think we can be. We're now strong, we're here to stay, the Arabs will know that. There's an ongoing war of attrition along our borders with the Arab country, but they still can't attack us completely. And then in 1973, on October 6th, there will be a surprise attack, one that we really only know about 24 hours before, hoping that they will postpone their attack when we let America know that they're going to attack at 6 p.m. on Yom Kippur Day. Instead, what they do is they move their attack up to 2 p.m. And that Olympus on which we were sitting in the aftermath of the Six-Day War is swept from under our feet. And to make a long story short, in 3 weeks, we win the war. And how do I know we won the war? Because we weren't annihilated. There was no middle ground. Jordan, by the way, stays out of this one. They have had their fill with wars against Israel. Also, truthfully, there's no love lost between the Palestinians who are marching around their country and had been up until 1970 in September, demanding that this is our country, they would say, with their own army headed by Yasser Arafat. King Hussein would go in September of 70 and kill hundreds and kick out thousands, including the leadership that amongst Palestinian lore would be known as Black September. It would be that group to be created with that name, an offshoot of the PLO, that would perpetrate the attacks against the Israeli athletes and trainers in Munich in 1972. But in 73, we're able to hold off Syria, hold off Egypt, and we don't get annihilated. So we win the war. And yet we lose the war. What do I mean we lose the war? We lose the war because 2,700 Israeli soldiers are killed, because 3 times that are wounded, at a population at the time of 3.5 million. There is a moment in which there is an internal realization that in fact we are not as strong as we thought we were. And Moshe Dayan himself later declassified radio contact between the officers will make it clear that he will have said in the early hours of the war, the third temple is going to fall. And that's the great Moshe Dayan. But thankfully, even if the higher echelons of our officers were overwhelmed, it was the younger officers, the soldiers, the officers, the reserve duty soldiers who did what they did and rose to the occasion. And yet we realized we weren't as strong as we thought we were. And in those early hours after the Yom Kippur War, hours in which songs like this that you can see on your screen were written and became a mantra, promising our children that that would be the last war, the memory of the Holocaust begins to change within us. If up until then we had told those Israelis who had come out of the Holocaust, meaning those Israelis who became Israeli citizens, don't tell me your story, and then we start to hear their story in 60, we begin to realize in 73 that maybe, just maybe, there's more than one kind of hero. And while surely there was heroism if those who stood up physically to the Nazis, we internalize that even if they lost their lives for the cause, which was heroic, which was the memory we wanted to hold on to, because that was the memory of Masada, standing up to the very end, that in fact there is heroism when you give a hand to a child ready to get on a train, knowing you're going to your death, giving strength to that child. Or holding on and telling that child, don't cry, sweetie, I'm staying with you. Or you want me to line up? I'll line up, because maybe I'll live another moment, another minute, another day. So we begin to internalize that in fact there's more than one way to be heroic. Those of you who've been to Israel and have seen the new museum that opened up in 2005, it took that many years for the change in how we remember the Holocaust to materialize into that new perspective. In addition, in the 1970s, we just want to be a nation of the world. And what we see here is going to be the last moments of the semifinals in 1977, when Israel will ultimately win the European Basketball Cup. And at the end of the semifinals, playing against the Soviet Union, the captain of the team, Tal Brody, out of the University of Illinois from Trenton, New Jersey, used to play basketball with my dad, immigrated in the early 70s and the late 60s, and then in the 70s, he was the captain of Maccabi Tel Aviv. He grabs the ball at the end of the game, and he will declare, after that incredible victory on their path to an incredible season, David and Goliath all over. You can read the subtitles here of the announcers, and ultimately Tal Brody's words themselves, in which he talks about Ralph Klein as the coach, but then Tal Brody will talk about what that moment means, not just for a sporting event. So this notion that we are on the map, not just in basketball, he embodied what Israelis wanted to feel. Now, we're not defined by the Yom Kippur War, and we know we're not defined by war in general, but it is part of who we are. It's in our psyche. And the 70s was a release, whether it was in sports or whether it was in music. And here we see an iconic moment. Because in 1977, those events take place. In the 70s, we also win the Eurovision Contest, which is a song festival that was incredible. Little Israel, with songs like Abana Bio Bobe, and then we win it a second time with a song called Hallelujah. We also, by the way, win a contest called the Miss Universe Contest, which should be abolished because we should never objectify anybody like that. But Israel wins. In 1976, we go beyond our borders and we save hostages, Jewish hostages, who are Israeli and who are not Israeli, who were taken by Palestinian European terrorists and forced to land in Uganda. Unheard of. And then we have the political upheaval of 1977, in which the Likud party will come to power. For the first time, the Labour Party will be ousted since the inception of this idea of the state, let alone the state itself. And as the voice of the Likud party, the voice of the underclass who put him in power, Menachem Begin, the hawk of hawks, will be the one who is going to sign a peace agreement with Anwar Sadat. Now, there was such disbelief that this could be happening that when Anwar Sadat comes to Jerusalem, to Tel Aviv and lands there, and then speaks in the parliament, in the Knesset, there were special forces at the airport who thought that his airplane was in fact going to be a Trojan horse. That was the level of disbelief, and yet Israel signs a peace agreement with its arch enemy, Egypt, with the man who led the Yom Kippur War. Until today, Egypt will claim that they won the October War because of the situation it put us in. And we have, for the first time, a land for peace agreement. Israel will return the Sinai in exchange for peace. Now, the 1980s, and I'm going to go through this a little faster than I had hoped, and if it's all right, I'm going to take maybe 10 extra minutes just to compensate for some of the time that I lost because of the technology.
We just need to finish, Ori, we just need to finish by 2:15 because we have another session starting.
Got it, for sure. So the 1980s will be a transitional decade as well, because several things will be happening. And what you're looking at is I speaking and you're reading this song written by Ehud Manor that was written in the mid-1980s, but it's describing a new reality. Up until now, Israel had rallied around itself and its government and its military because all of our wars had been wars that we called wars of no other choice. And then 1982 comes along. The ambassador to England will be shot in an assassination attempt, the Israeli ambassador. And when this happens, Israel Argov is going to ultimately die about 20 years later. But this will be the catalyst which will project Israel into Lebanon to get the Palestinian terrorists out. And they've been using Lebanon as a base to attack Israel from the late 60s and early 70s, all the way through the 70s. But that war in which Israeli soldiers will find themselves in literally the mud of Lebanon for 18 years. This song, I think, is going to be indicative of a new way of looking at ourselves. And we shouldn't compare what America was going through vis-a-vis its American soldiers that were in Vietnam and the really painful challenge that those vets had when they returned to America. Really, there seemed to be animosity against the soldiers themselves. Here, the tension was with, for the first time, the government protesting our soldiers being in Lebanon. Because in fact, these soldiers were all of our children. And this particular song, I have no other country. Even when it's a flame, I will not give up on my country, even if I don't recognize it anymore. And this will be transformative. In the 80s, once again, we go out and we take care of our own as we begin to see the first of two major waves of immigration of Jews from Ethiopia. Now, we shouldn't think that there's a paternalistic activity going on where Israel brought them over. These Jews from Ethiopia, because of famine, because of civil war and anti-Semitism, are mobilized along with Mossad agents who come from Israel and they begin to march through the Sudanese desert in a modern-day exodus. Ultimately, in 1984, Operation Moses will bring to Israel 7,400 Jews, and then the operation closes down because the Sudanese government will shut it down. But this will be the first of two major immigrations. In 1991, we see a second wave, which will be called Operation Solomon, in which 12,500 Jews will come over and immigrate to Israel with the assistance of the State of Israel. In the 1990s, transitions are going to happen because of an event called the First Intifada, the First Uprising. This First Uprising will ultimately come to an end in 1993. It comes to an end when this handshake takes place. And I'm sure we all remember seeing it live or after the events. And Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, surprising Israel, surprising the world, secret negotiations, September of 1993, are going to shake hands and ultimately reach a decision that the grassroots uprising that started in 1987 in Gaza, which gave birth to a terrorist organization called Hamas, will ultimately direct the new government of Israel at the time, the Labor Party, and Yitzhak Rabin, the chief of staff, who had been prime minister already once in the 1970s, replacing Golda Meir, who stepped down in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, to shake hands with his sworn enemy, literally a terrorist with blood on his hands. And Yitzhak Rabin will make it very clear when he receives the Nobel Prize for Peace, along with Arafat and Shimon Peres, that one makes peace with their enemies and not with their friends. What you can see on the left is the decision that was made in stages, ultimately to take the area of the West Bank, to divide it into areas A, B, and C. Areas A would be areas in which the Palestinians were in control of security and civil matters. Areas B, areas in which Palestinians would be in control of civil matters, but Israel in charge of security. And area C would be areas in which Israel would be in charge of both security and civil matters. It had to do on demographics. With that, we begin to see a wave of terrorism hit Israel by the Hamas. For the first time, we're introduced to bus bombings. 1994, October, the first time we have in our collective memory one of these bus bombings in front of the Dizengoff Center Mall in Tel Aviv. Bus number 5, I believe it was. We all have our stories of near misses, and this is going to continue all the way through as we continue to move forward in these talks with the Palestinians. In addition, there's going to be violent demonstrations that are taking place in the streets by Jewish Israelis against any kind of agreement with the Palestinians. I said both of those things consecutively, one after each other. My goal was not to create a moral equivalency. I just want to be clear with that. But both are happening simultaneously. 1995, November. There is a rally in the city of Tel Aviv in which Shimon Peres, Yitzhak Rabin, other dignitaries, celebrities, singers will get together in front of a crowd of about 200,000 Israelis who are there. The theme of the rally was say yes to peace and no to violence. It's a Saturday night, November 4th, 1995. It comes to an end. And the entourage begins to make their way to their vehicles. And when they do, one by one, first Shimon Peres comes down the stairs, stops at the closed off streets, takes it all in, gets into his car and drives off. Then Laya Rabin and Yitzhak Rabin come down the stairs. He too pauses, looks out, and as you can see in the Yediot Achronot newspaper headline here, you can see the aftermath. A Jewish assassin will murder Yitzhak Rabin, the democratically elected prime minister. I have to tell you, there were many of us at that point in our lives, post-army, post-travel around the world, pre-children, pre-marriage, who said, here are the keys, thank you very much, I'm out of here. This is not the country I signed up for. This is not the country I served with honor. I am not going to raise any of my children in this country if this is who we are. This is what they do. It's not what we do. In fact, there was a generation younger than I at the time of 15, 16, 17-year-olds who would sit around in circles in the square, then called the Kings of Israel Square to become known as Rabin Square, singing song and lighting candles, because here was a generation about to start their military service who looked towards this 72-year-old politician who was also a grandfather, agree with him, don't agree with him, who perhaps was trying to create a reality that they wouldn't have to spend 3 years in the military. Now, I should be clear. It's not that at the time we had a camp in Israel that was for peace and another camp that was against peace. Everybody wanted peace. There were those who said, if Rabin is going to shake hands with this Yasser Arafat, who is a terrorist, then who am I not to give it a chance? And there were those who said, with all due respect to Rabin, and we have a lot of respect, we can't trust him. Look at what's been happening. And this country was like this, ripping itself apart. I want to also be very clear that whatever it is we think about what should be done today between the Palestinians and the Israelis, none of the decisions that are taken here are taken in a laboratory. It's not that we can try something and if it doesn't work out, we'll just remix the ingredients. There are real ramifications for when peace doesn't work out. And truthfully, no matter if we're on the farthest left politically or we're on the farthest right politically, we all have young people in our lives as we speak. Sons and daughters and nieces and nephews who are on our front line because we all care about this place. If I come back to myself for a moment, I'll tell you that that decision, whether to give back the keys and to leave, was very quickly changed, even though we knew why people for weeks and even months, we had tears in their eyes because we said, if this is going to be a place that we care about, and in fact that flag means something, we need to stay here and make a difference. This was that period of time in the 90s. And that time in the 90s would open us up to the year 2000 when we pulled our troops out of Lebanon. By the way, the reason we stayed in Lebanon was to stop terrorists from coming in and having to deal with those terrorists in our kibbutz homes and children's homes. And many of us who were in combat units at the time during those years spent time in Lebanon with our eyes forward and the lights of Israel to our back, and knowing that we were that last line of defense, which in fact was the reason, if you ask me, why in 1967 or 1948 or 1973, we were able to overcome what we came. And again, it has nothing to do with political affiliation. It has everything to do with being able to look over your shoulder and to see the lights of your home and know that there's nobody else in between. And I can promise you, in those units, and I wasn't even a good idea in 1967, but in those units were those who voted the entire rainbow. Clearly, all of them cared about their home. And I know other countries have had their hills in Iwo Jima, in Korea, in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and they've been there for their buddies and they've been there for their flag. But I have to tell you, I've had my own experiences, and there is real power when you see the lights of your home. The second Intifada is going to begin, the Second Uprising, which will be much more bloody, both for the Palestinians and for the Israelis. During all of this, we also begin to recognize that Israel is this startup nation. I don't know if I should use the word despite it all or because of it all. Already from the 1980s, early 90s, as we transition away from that socialist lifestyle to a more open economy and recognize that we have no oil, we have no real resources of any kind other than the human resource. The notion of the startup nation, as the title of the book by Dan Senior and Saul Singer says, will define in many ways who we are as Israelis. This concept of ingenuity because we have no other choice. Within this world of challenge, and hopefully I'm clear enough, but I want to be very clear. Whatever I've described, we shouldn't think that Israel is perfect. God forbid. And by the way, it's okay to be critical of Israel. Just get in line behind Israelis because we do it better than anyone else. Just look at our headlines. Look at the stalemate that we had for 500 days before we saw a new government just yesterday be sworn in. And yet, if we are going to be critical, I think there's also room that we better be able to be proud of what we've achieved here, which, by the way, includes what Israel does for the world. And I'm sure all of you remember a moment, if not many moments, where you saw that Israeli flag and that Israeli IDF sign in Haiti, in Turkey, in Japan, in Mexico, around the world, oftentimes first team on the ground. Not to mention within that high-tech and biotech and all the things that Israel is doing to make the world a better place. And the threats continue. And we know our story in Lebanon doesn't end just because we left as per the United Nations demands. And we know that the greater geopolitical reality that we find around us doesn't let us sit nicely on the sidelines, even when, al panav, on the face of things, it has nothing to do with Israel. If you wanted, we could go into now the annals of the world war that are taking place in Syria. That starts in March of 2011. Has nothing to do with Israel. The grassroots rebellion that happened had to do when the majority of Syrians who are Sunnis looked at the leadership who are Shiites and said, there's no water management. You are regulating us to the lower tiers of society. You are an oppressive regime. And those demonstrations will then unfold into a civil war. They will unfold into a world war as Al-Qaeda will come and back its Sunni brothers, as Iran will back its vassal state Syria and bring Hezbollah, the Shiite terrorist organization from Lebanon. This reality has Israel on the sidelines, and yet Iran has made it very clear, we are going to annihilate you. And if anything, Israelis have learned that if somebody tells you that they're going to kill you, you should believe them. And yet that doesn't define us. It doesn't drive. What drives me, what concerns me, honestly, is whether I'll get home in time to pick up my daughters from dance. I'm not oblivious to the threat, but it doesn't define me. Here we have other examples. In 2005, Israel pulls its civilians out of the Gaza Strip. We have ongoing rockets. We have the invention of the Iron Dome. I'm sure you've heard of the Iron Dome, this interceptor missile to protect. And we come to modern times. And the modern times that we've come to is a moment in time where I have to be honest, I think as an Israeli, I find myself at a moment of cognitive dissonance. I am used to the world coming off the plane when I was a tour guide on buses. They would look at me and say, oh, Uri, we're so concerned for you. Feel so bad for you. You must be so worried all the time. And I almost felt bad to shatter their perception of who we are. And I told them, listen, I appreciate it, but you know what? We're good. We have issues, we have threats, but so does everybody. And this new reality with the coronavirus has placed us in a situation where we are all on equal playing fields. That we all understand what it means when we talk about being in shelter in place. And we know what it means when I talk about how difficult it is to sit with a mask on for a long time. In this particular image that you see here, and I'll talk about briefly where we are now, but Israel kind of jumped on that protective bandwagon pretty quick, so much so that on our Memorial Day, we actually shared together. Israelis were told not to go to the cemeteries, the military cemeteries. And in fact, medical personnel and volunteers went and they spent time sending images to the families of their loved ones at their graves. Of course, the flyover, I think you've had similar things, thanking our frontline teams. Moments like this, and I'm not going to read this whole quote here, but this also came out of this period of time. We have 2 paramedics in the same ambulance. This image doesn't prove that everything is right in the world and that everything is right in Israel, and there is challenges here and there's discrimination here. And we push the envelope to whether this is a democracy or not, but truthfully, there are other bigger siblings of Israel that are democracies that push the envelope as well. And yet, this also happens. Muslims and Jews working together. And I truthfully think that this reality, and as you're reading David Grossman's excerpt from his quote in Haaretz paper back in March, he's talking about maybe something will come out of it, because the majority, not the majority, but much of our medical personnel, doctors, nurses, pharmacists, are Israeli Arabs. And we're all in this together. Whether we're shopping for other people, whether we're going to visit grandparents at a distance. We weren't able to do that, by the way, up until 2 weeks ago. Now we can. Things are changing. The reality of our corona experience here. Hold on, I'm just going to show you these last couple of images, and I'm gonna shut down the shared slideshow because we're rounding it off to an end here. And I did want to say a couple more things, and that is to tell you that where we are today with the coronavirus, our first infected person was back in February 22nd. It was a woman who had come off of the Diamond Princess cruise ship. Remember, that was in Japan. After being quarantined there, Israel finally flew the Israelis who were on board back to Israel. Our first death was in the middle of March. And it seems as if Israel's been able to flatten that arch, that curve, because of various decisions that were made. Clearly, it's an unfolding event that's taking place. But if we look at what's happening right now as we speak, we've had 16,400 Israelis who were infected with the coronavirus. And just to remind you, our population is just over 9 million. Currently, we have 3,400 who are infected. The rest have recovered. Of those who are ill, there are 59 who are seriously ill, and there are 48 who are on ventilators. And very sadly, we have 272 who have died. Now, I know those numbers sound almost insignificant, not that the individuals are, of course. We all know that a single life, of course, is of the world itself. But clearly, compared to other countries of similar sizes, Israel seems to be doing a good job. Now, there's mistakes that were made, and there's inconsistencies, and there's lots of clarity that is not there. All of this is true as well, but we've gotten to a point where we've now opened up our schools, and we've opened up our economy to a certain degree. Only 30% now are actually physically in their places of employment, and yet we have many of our shops on the street are open, malls have become open, movie theaters not yet, restaurants not yet. There are serious restrictions. You have to wear a mask when you leave the home. Only, depending on the size of the shop, only a certain amount of people are allowed to go into the shop. So there's still lots of restrictions, and it'll be interesting to see what happens in 2 weeks. Because Israelis, under duress, under rocket fire, we follow orders. We're told to go to reserve duty for a month. I'll go. I'll do what I need to do. I'll go in the shelter because there's rockets. I'll go. I'll do what I need to do. You want me to stay in my house now, shelter in place? I'll do what I need to do. And we seem, for the most part, there are pockets of society that did not adhere to those regulations, but for the most part, we followed orders. And now that we're out and about, that's when Israelis start to say, you know what? I know better. And when things are good, we're at each other's throats. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in 2 weeks, whether or not we have a relapse. Hopefully, God willing, we won't. But within the midst of all of this, we had our elections. And we had our third elections. And we had finally, yesterday, our coalition, which has come together finally in what is called an emergency national unity coalition, in which the Likud party, with Benjamin Netanyahu at its head, will rotate in 18 months so that the blue and white party, with Benny Gantz at the head, will become prime minister. 36 ministers, the largest government we've ever had, and there's a lot of challenge to that from within society. What will be, that we'll have to wait and see. And for those of us who voted for Benny Gantz, we hope that there is just something we're not seeing as he went back on all of his campaign promises that he would never sit with a prime minister who is indicted on 3 accounts, whose trial is going to start on breach of trust and bribery. And yet from what he has shared, the reason he did this, 1, because without it, we would have gone to a 4th election and Israel could not have survived a 4th election. And 2, we are at a war right now. And the war is with the coronavirus and we needed a unified government. So what will be, I don't know. I do know that I want to apologize for going overtime because of those technical difficulties. And I want you to also know that giving me the opportunity to share with you the trajectory of our Jewish history from the days of the Second Temple, hopefully has given you new information, but has allowed me also, every time I teach this information, is to be able to reevaluate, where do I stand in all of this? Because I ask a lot of questions, but those questions are also geared inward towards me. And I think one of the reasons we have 71, we had 81, 90 people at one point on this in this class is because all of you are asking the same questions, and that is, hopefully, what am I doing in this class, sitting for so long, hearing about Jewish history? Why do I care? And why do I care about the state of Israel? How is that relevant to me? And if you are asking that question, you should know you're not alone, because I asked the same question. And I think that, in fact, is what has made us so strong, with the ability to survive for so long, because of our inner ability, at times perhaps to be at each other's throats, but really to look inward and to reevaluate and to adapt. And truthfully, to understand that we are more than just one place. We are a people, an Am Yisrael, and we are connected on so many different ways. So, while there's more that we could say, I want to thank you all for this experience. I want to thank Rabbis Boxman for allowing me to be a part of your communities. And it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. On behalf of all of us, Ori, we say to you, Hamon Todah. You've not only brought us the facts as you understand them and have taught them to us, but your passion, your personality have come through to help us connect. I think this is a great medium for us out of this coronavirus, where we've connected to our Israeli brothers and sisters. We all feel a share in this story of the Jewish people that we're all part of and still living out. And you've let us feel that sense of challenge and pride.
Thank you.
It was a masterful job.
Thank you.
I just say to all of you out there, but especially my congregants, that please God, a year from now, I'll be able to lead. I'm looking to lead 2 trips to Israel, one for first timers and one for those who have been with me. And so if you're interested, I will. And I hope Ori will be able to be on board with at least one of those trips, if not both.
Thank you.
And so anyway, thank you to all.
Thank you, Yuri. You're wonderful.
Thank you, Lori.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you so much.
And I'll be sending out a recorded lesson for those of you who want to step off and want to take a look at it
You're so
again.
cute on top of it.
He is.
To your family, Ori.
You know what? At this point, I'll just take it. Bring it on.
Oh, thank you so much. You did a fabulous
Thanks.
job. We learned so much. You made us
We
really proud to be Jewish. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very
Bye, everybody.
Too young.
All